Hello everybody, as many of you guys are already aware of, we have so many new makeup releases coming on the market every single day, and I think that it becomes really easy to forget that so many of these releases end up being very similar to each other. There are certain makeup categories, for instance, for example, eyeshadow palettes that I find myself very attracted to, and I have found that it is so easy to forget that so many eyeshadow palettes can be quite similar. Of course, you have like some very unique looking color schemes, but a lot of times they're very similar. So for today, I decided to talk about a whole bunch of green eyeshadow palettes, and I'm going to break this video down into a few parts. First off, I'm going to tell you about a few monochromatic green palettes that I love and own and use all the time. And something else that I did is I looked online and I found all the monochromatic green palettes that I could find, and I put them in a folder. And I'm going to be sharing that folder with you guys. We're going to be talking about it. I'm going to be sharing with you my opinions on the color schemes found in these palettes. I'm going to be telling you which palettes I like better, which palettes I don't really find myself that drawn to. We're going to be analyzing similarities between a few of these palettes. I obviously haven't tried every single green eyeshadow palette that I'll be mentioning in this video, but this video is mainly to inspire you to look at the similarities between certain makeup launches and really analyze makeup in a rather objective manner. I personally have found myself very much drawn to the color green. I love green in my clothing, and I also love green in makeup. Something that I did notice recently, though, was that I didn't necessarily have a lot of green monochromatic palettes in my collection, and I made an effort to add some to my collection in the past few months. So as a result, I have 3 brand new additions of green eyeshadow palettes to my collection that I've been head over heels in love with. First, I want to talk about the Melt Cosmetics Smoke Sessions palette. So this is beautiful version of a green monochromatic color scheme. You have so many different versions of green in here. You have like your more minty greens down towards the bottom. Then you have like some sage greens. Then you also have, sorry, I'm terribly out of focus. You have also some like golden greens right there. Very beautiful color scheme. I use this constantly and I love this palette. It is absolutely stunning and I love it. Another palette that I added to my collection after I got this one was the Tri palette by Juvia's Place. This is another version of a palette I consider to be a monochromatic green palette, with a few exceptions in the form of this color and this color, but on the whole, I do think that this has a green color scheme. At the time when I bought this palette, it was filling a few holes in my collection because the other green palette that I had was this palette right here. So clearly these palettes are quite different. You definitely have a lot of metallic tones in this palette, but with this palette, this gave me the opportunity to own a few like green shadows, mainly this one, and this one, that I didn't necessarily have that many duplicates of because these are mattes, and in this palette you have like a whole bunch of metallics. This one right here, the Kaleidos Futurism 1 Sci-Fi Green palette. So this is the most recent addition to my collection, and I actually haven't had a chance to try this out that much. Getting this palette was definitely filling a space in my collection that previously hadn't been filled yet, because this palette really resembles, in my mind, an olive tone palette. And if you look at the other 2 green palettes that I have, those palettes couldn't necessarily be described as possessing olive tones, whereas this one does, therefore filling a hole in my collection. Therefore, great purchase, and I'm very happy with it. With these green palettes, I'm all set to create whatever kind of green makeup look I want, because I have my minty greens, I have my sage greens, I have my evergreens, I have a variety of different undertones all present in these 3 palettes. So with that being said, I also want to talk about some other green palettes that are present in the makeup industry. So I am going to open my folder right here. I have like an entire folder on my phone that is dedicated to green palettes, and there are so many palettes in this folder. There's a lot. So the first palettes I want to talk about are palettes that have green and a little bit of yellowy gold tones in there as well. So the first palette that matches that description would be this one right here. This is from e.l.f. and this actually is a palette that came out in August of last year, I think. So I actually haven't heard much about this palette, but I do think that this palette is a good example of a green palette that has a few very distinct gold tones in here. So you do have a few yellowy greens in here, you have a few gold shades, you also have some neutrals, so you have like a few color families all juxtaposed in one palette. So if you're interested in that kind of all-encompassing version of an eyeshadow palette and you don't already have a few of these shades, this might be a great option for you. This palette is the Blush Tribe Lila 2 palette. So right off the bat, this is a mostly matte palette. You do have a combination of green and yellow tones in here as well. However, you do have like a little bit of mintier greens mixed into this palette as well. So in that sense, it is slightly different from the e.l.f. Cosmetics version, but it has a few similarities, and I think that this is actually a little bit of a better version of an all-encompassing green palette because you do have so much variation between the shades in this particular palette. Another palette that I think is extremely similar to both of the last two palettes that I mentioned would be this one right here from the brand Georgie's Cosmetics. This is the Earth Pressed Pigment and Glitter palette. You have a ton of different shades in here, and you also have a few pressed glitters. So if you're interested in a color scheme that has a yellowy greeny tone to it, if you're also interested in a few more cooler tone greens as well, and if you want a few pressed glitters to add to your collection, this would be a good option as well. I personally don't find myself that drawn to this palette because while you do have a few really beautiful green shades in here, you have a lot of pressed glitters, for me at least, and I don't necessarily like pressed glitters at the moment. So this is not necessarily one that I would get, but if you're into pressed glitters, this might be a good option. Another palette that I think is also quite similar to those palettes would be this one right here from Morphe. This is called the Making Bank eyeshadow palette. You have yellows in here. You also have a touch of olive. You have a few true greens. You have a few cooler tone greens as well. So again, this is another all-encompassing monochromatic green palette with a touch of yellow and gold. You also have a few really neutral shades in here as well. So this is a good palette, I think, if you're interested in maybe mixing in some greens with yellows and neutrals to create a little bit more of a balanced look. This might be a good option for you. Also, another palette that I think is actually quite similar to a lot of the palettes that I just mentioned would be the ColourPop Just My Luck palette. Now, I want to flash the ColourPop Just My Luck palette on the screen along with the Blush Tribe Lila 2 palette, the Earth palette from Georgie's Cosmetics, and the e.l.f. palette. So they kind of have like a few similar shades in them. The color schemes are sort of similar. They're not identical, but they have a similar vibe. These are palettes from very different brands, very different price points, but nevertheless, I definitely think they have a few similarities. Interestingly enough, the Morphe 18B Making Bank palette is probably the most unique one that I've just mentioned because it has that combination of neutral and green in it. But at the same time, it does have a few very similar shades to the other palettes on the screen right now as well. I want to segue into another subcategory and talk about mintier green shades, more cooler tone greens that are not as yellow but still very true to green. So let's talk about this palette right here. This is the Ace Beauté Oceanic palette. Now, this palette has a little bit of olive in it, it has a little bit of blues, it has a little bit of very cooler tone greens. So you definitely don't necessarily see a lot of yellowy greens in this palette. You have a few, but not that many. A palette in my mind is actually quite similar to this, but in a much smaller format would be the Smoke Sessions palette. I think that this palette has a ton of really cooler tone greens in here. You have like a few golds at the end, but if you cover these up, this palette just transforms into a very cool tone green moment. So this palette in my mind is quite similar to the Ace Beauté Oceanic palette. Even though right off the bat they look quite different, I actually think they're quite similar. Also, I think another palette that is quite similar would be the Give Me Glow Cosmetics Juicy Olive palette. Now, this is a little bit of a more curated color scheme. you do have a lot of really concentrated olivey tones in this palette. So this is definitely kind of different from the palettes that I just mentioned because it doesn't have as many mint. It's more of a true olivey green palette, but it is still, in my mind, a little bit similar to a few palettes that I have to mention in this video as well. I think that it's probably most similar to the Kaleidos palette because you have like that similar olivey green vibe, even though this palette is definitely not marketed as an olivey green palette. It kind of has like a similar color scheme. This palette also has a few similarities to the, let me pull it up, Gemini palette from Melt Cosmetics. Now, the Gemini palette also has a few similarities to the Morphe palette. The Morphe palette has a few neutrals in here, so does the Gemini palette. But both of these palettes also possess a few olivey tone shades, making them quite similar to the Give Me Glow palette. However, I do want to mention a palette that I think might be a little bit of a unique palette in this video, because I haven't necessarily talked about a ton of exclusively mint-toned green palettes in this video because they're not necessarily that common. A palette that is a little bit new that is definitely a minty green version of a makeup palette would be this one from ColourPop. This is a Mint to Be palette. Obviously you have a few neutrals in here, but this palette is very distinctly a mint green color scheme, and it is quite interesting because you have a lot of pastel greens in here as well. And pastel greens are not something that we see a lot of on the market right now. We have a few palettes that have pastel greens, but not many. And this is an interesting palette for that reason. Of course, you can probably dupe a few of the shades in this palette with a few of the other palettes that I've mentioned in this video already, but this is definitely a little bit more of a unique palette in this video, I think, because of that very strong pastel mint color scheme. Another palette I think is kind of similar in the sense that it has a few lighter pastel-ish green shades would be this one right here. This is the Norvina Pro Pigment Volume 2 palette, the mini one. And yes, like just right off the bat, this doesn't necessarily look like a monochromatic green palette, and it's not necessarily a monochromatic green palette, but there are a few lighter green shades in here. With that being said though, those are all the green eyeshadow palettes that I wanted to mention in this video. It's kind of a lot to process for me, in my personal opinion, because my head is kind of spinning. But I hope that you guys enjoyed this video and hopefully found it a little bit enlightening. I did make this video to encourage you to perhaps look at makeup releases in a little bit of a more objective manner to really evaluate the similarities and differences between certain products. There are so many different iterations of green eyeshadow palettes, and I think that it is really worthwhile to see what kinds of eyeshadow colors you are attracted to, what really draws your attention, what you like to wear on yourself, and make sure that you get a really beautiful color scheme that really appeals to those needs that you have for a green eyeshadow palette. Thank you so much for staying with me till the end of this video. I do hope that this was helpful, and I will see you all next time. Bye guys.